So much. Good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Cradle-to-Career Governing Board Ad Hoc Committee meeting. Pleasure to have all of you once again. We're going to open the meeting at 1:01 p.m. and now I'll ask for a roll call. Catalina Cifuentes.
Present.
Tom Vu.
Here.
Amy Fong.
Here.
Jessica Moldoff.
Here.
And Gavin Payne.
Sorry, here.
No worries. We may have other members of the ad hoc committee joining us at some point during the meeting, but we're going to get started now that we have quorum established. This afternoon, we'll be digging deeper into our strategic planning work, specifically around two focus areas, and you can see the agenda before you. I'm going to draw your attention to the discussion of the strategic planning approach, just to reacquaint ourselves with the framework that we had established last time that we were together. And then two very specific areas, one that focuses on strategy and operations, specifically around operations, and then discussion around analytical data. In light of our limited time, when we get to those points during the agenda, I'm going to make sure that we stay and remain focused on those two areas within those domains, because the group is going to be going through a lot of content, and we want to make sure that we accomplish our objectives for today. So with that, let me turn it over now to Jane Harrington from LRI to get us started.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon to everybody. It is something of a sunny day here in Sacramento. I hope it is sunny where you are. Nice to be with you all again. So first off, let's talk through the approach that we set out in our first meeting together. We'll revisit first this roadmap. 2 weeks ago, we kicked off this series of meetings and are now on meeting number 2. As Robert stated, our conversation today will be focused on two areas: strategy and operations and analytical data. In a few weeks, we'll have a third and final meeting of this committee, and the outcome of this series is to have recommendations ready for your governing board at the August meeting. This next visual helps define and organize the planning terms we are using, and also shows who is responsible for these different pieces. As you know, we're not starting from scratch, but building on the extensive planning work that's been done in the last few years. C2C already has its mission, its vision, along with its charge as specified in the legislation. That's captured in those blue ovals. This committee is focused on the green, the goals and the objectives. Once those are set, it turns to the office to take action to meet those goals and objectives, as shown in that outer orange oval. Work is well underway at C2C, and we're also relying on that draft work plan they created last year to help frame that work. In particular, the 4 focus areas that identify those different areas of work. Like I said, for today, we'll be focusing on both analytical data and strategy and operations. I'll note again that it's at this stage when we're setting these measurable objectives where we have to start making hard decisions and trade-offs as we consider requirements, timing, and capacity. Much of the work that is on C2C's plate right now is already known. As you will see, that work has been captured in draft objectives for this committee's review today. As we do that together, we want to ask some questions. What are we required to do? What's the logical order? What needs to happen first? The dependencies, the natural phases for the work? What's C2C's work? And what's within our control? What requires others' cooperation? And then what actually belongs to others to do? And also, what's out of scope? As before, I'll be guiding us through these conversations. I will say at the outset today, We want to get to approving recommendations to the board, so we're set up for that August board meeting. For that reason, I might lean in just a bit more to keep us focused and moving towards those recommendations today. I might also use the concept of a parking lot to capture items for future discussions that might not get captured in all of the objectives today. Finally, I'll share this visual that was in the materials. This captures a lot of the activities and work streams C2C is currently tasked with. And while I don't want to dig into the detail here, I think the takeaway is more high level. It's a lot. These two highlighted efforts at the bottom in orange contribute to the P20W data points and ensure data quality are not small and are core, are required of this office to do. And they need to be completed by summer of 2026. So one of the purposes of strategic planning is to ensure that the scope and the cadence of the work is realistic so that C2C can implement a set of functional tools. The goals and objectives for the next several years will need to be grounded in how existing data can be linked and made available without duplicating existing tools. These alone will be enormous accomplishments. So as we think about what else C2C can accomplish in the next few years, let's keep in mind what work C2C is already committed to accomplishing. Any questions from the committee on our approach so far? All right, seeing none, let's dive in, but feel free to raise your hand at any point if questions come up. We will start with strategy and operations. I'll guide on process and ask C2C Executive Director Marianne Bates to step in for some of the more detailed content. Marianne, can you now talk us through the problem and goal for this area we previewed in that first meeting?
Sure. So again, we have our four main areas. This one is strategy and operations, and mainly focusing on the operations. So as we discussed last time, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Prior to Cradle-to-Career, there was no central neutral state entity authorized and funded to bring together C2C relevant data across different domains. No entity was empowered to facilitate this information integration across silos to provide insights, improve coordination, and remove barriers across large institutions. So this is the problem that we discussed last time. And the big picture for this area of our work is essentially establishing our office and establishing our work overall. One thought that I wanted to share is we reflected on the last meeting and looked at our four areas: operations, analytical data, the practical tools for students, and engagement. Strategy really cuts across all of those four. So one thing that you might consider is providing more clarity by simply shortening the label for this focus area or domain and call it operations only, as opposed to strategy and operations, which might confuse matters a bit. That would also provide clarity that what the goal and the objectives for this area are kind of squarely focused on the operations of the office, and strategy is needed across all areas. So that's one area for you to consider. We also discussed the goal last time. So first we started with the problem we're trying to solve. So what's the goal? The goal is to establish and operate a new state entity that uses secure, effective, and efficient processes and procedures to earn and keep the trust of data providers and the public. So that's what we had drafted for the goal. Jane, should we pause here or should we talk about the objectives as well?
Let's move on through all of the objectives and then catch all the discussion at once. We'll see how that goes.
Thank you. So what we've done next is to think about the requirements and the legislation and what we already have on our plate in our 5-year plan, and tried to draft some potential objectives for your consideration. And again, these focus on the operations of the office. So the first one is focused on our team and our hiring. So the first objective is to fill established positions for the office, 16 in total, by summer 2023. So those are the 16 established positions we currently have, having those fully filled by this summer. That connects a bit. I'll actually jump down to the fourth bullet point as I voice this over. We would then fill all of the proposed positions for the office pending budget approval by winter 2023. So this would include the 10 additional positions that are in the budget request that's currently being considered in the budget cycle. So those two bullet points relate to staffing up the team, 16 by this summer, a total of 26 by this winter. The second bullet point, refine and establish necessary office procedures, policies, and frameworks by this fall. So this is continuing the work to ensure that we have all of the processes in place that we need as a brand new state entity. The third bullet point, define fiscal and human resources needed to achieve C2C's statutory charge by fall 2023, is also intended to be a goal of having more specific forward-looking projections based on the first 2 years of our work, to accurately define here's what we'll need in how we continue to staff the office and implement our work. So doing some of the more prospective projections there. The top bullet point here on our second page of objectives is to house the Cradle-to-Career office in an inclusive space designed to foster community engagement by spring 2024. So our team is actively working with DGS to define this and find the right space that really focuses on having a large place where we can hold not only the board meetings and our advisory board meetings, but also community engagement events, trainings, and things like that as we move forward with our work. And then the last objective is to ensure that operations, policies, and credibility of fully established new state entity are in place by summer 2026. So that's kind of the summary objective at the end, looking towards summer 2026 is the endpoint that's for a lot of our goals that's defined in legislation. All right, I'll pause there and turn it back over to Jane.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne. And so at this point, we can start to move through our discussion. So we really want to focus on those objectives. Are they smart? And also, do they fit that rubric that I shared at the start of the meeting? I just dropped it in the chat again. So what are we required to do? What's the logical order? What's C2C's work and what's out of scope? And I see Amy's hand, so let's jump into discussion.
Thanks, Jane. I just wanted to say I really appreciate Marianne really kind of walking us through all of that. And I appreciate the suggestion on the edit to remove strategy, because it does cut across all of really all of those different areas. So I like that change. The other thing that I noticed, and I think maybe we want to think about, is the word credibility here on this slide, because as I think about SMART goals, they really ought to be measurable and things like that. And so maybe we, could find a different word choice for credibility. Maybe it's the maturity of the office that we're looking for, or something else that is more easily measured.
Any thoughts on that? Thanks, Amy. Any thoughts from the group on those two suggestions? Tom?
Oh, thank you. I was just about to raise my hand. Yeah, I agree with Amy to the extent that I'm not quite sure what's meant by credibility of the office.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess, by Amy's definition, it could be maturity of the office, but perhaps we can lay out some other options, or a list of different things about what credibility may mean. Because just by the word itself, it could mean a lot of different things.
Excellent. So playing real time with some words on the screen here. Others on this? we could just move credibility altogether and keep operations and policies for a fully functioning new state entity in there as enough of an objective.
I guess it's a question for Marianne. What are we trying to capture with that word credibility to begin with? And that might help us either identify a different word that's a little bit more measurable and less nebulous, or allow us to just reframe that objective to accomplish what we're trying to do without that confusion.
I think the word was intended to capture some of the wording that's in legislation and some of the other foundational documents around being a trusted source of information. So what would it look like, right? If the public, for instance, comes to our website and understands it to be a trusted source of information. I think it also has to do with, we were also thinking about how different entities within the state interact with each other, whether it's with control agencies or other state partners. So I think it was meant to capture a lot. And I'm hearing that the word credibility isn't capturing it in a way that really makes sense and feels measurable. So, either just removing it entirely or, fully established, fully mature, new state entity. Maybe the fully established new state entity captures a lot of what was intended with that word.
I think that would be fine for me. I think that maybe we can pick up credibility somewhere later down the line when we actually have tools up and running and we can kind of measure how many people are using it and where it shows up in research and things like that as an alternative. So rather than get bogged down with sort of wordsmithing right now.
Great. Jessica, more to add?
Yeah, I think to add to that, just the fact it says policies here, but it also says policies in the third bullet. So it's like, which policies are we trying to establish by fall 2023 versus summer 2026? So yeah, I think probably being broader and like just saying like fully established new state entity by summer 2026 makes sense, because hopefully the operations policies don't take that long if we are going to establish a lot of them by the end of this year.
Excellent. So I've made some real time edits there, but Jessica, what I hear you saying is just to broaden it a little bit. And some of those things are assumed once it's fully established that those will actually be in place, and maybe sooner than later. Gavin?
So perhaps instead of fully established, we can say it in terms of fully functioning new state entity, because that will have demonstrated that we've got all of those things in place.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you for the edits. And I know on the previous slide, we've got 4 more objectives. So I'm going to take this opportunity to go back there and hear from the group.
Maybe a question for the group for your consideration when you look at these objectives. And this goes back to something that Jane was asking about in terms of logical order. So that's also another test, right? Are the dependencies here in the right order? They're both based in terms of like how we want the office to grow, but also in terms of the priorities that we have more broadly speaking for the office. That's something for consideration for the group.
I actually really like the focus on the staffing and the human resources here in these objectives, because I think it's really critical to have that capacity in order to accomplish the things in the work plan.
What else? So we need people to do the work. So that gets us to what are we required to do? We've got to get the folks in there. Robert's addressed the logical order. Are there dependencies? And also, this doesn't come up so much in operations, but what's within our control as C2C and what requires others cooperation. So I don't know if you see that coming up in any of these objectives.
Well, the only thing I see, or I guess the main thing I see that's out of our control is the pending budget approval. So I guess I don't know if it would be helpful to kind of add something on to there, being like, if it does not get approved, like what is the next step after that? Like, would then the step by some time be to basically request the positions again? Like, do we kind of add that that contingency plan into this?
Hmm.
I think it's similar to Jessica's point, although addressing it from a different angle. Marianne, I know that one of the priorities for you as executive director has been, having an equity orientation around the team, collaboration around the team, right? Like those kinds of values, which perhaps are much harder to measure. But there's an assumption that once you've got an office in place, you want it to operate in a certain way. You have some thought around that, as far as is that the appropriate place for it here, or is it assumed that that's part of how we're hiring, part of how we're building up the team, like that kind of capacity building?
Great question. So to respond to Jessica's first, one way we could think about your question of, what happens if the budget decision is not to approve these 10 positions would be that could be captured in the third bullet point, right? And in this annual cycle of us creating a work plan, if those positions were not approved, then what actions would we take? I think that could be captured in the third bullet point. And then the fourth bullet point could be revised as we revisit our work plan annually. So I think that could be captured. The third bullet point essentially already captures that. Robert, you're raising a really important point, because I think in drafting these, we're very focused on the SMART, right? Measurable, objective, everything that Jane put in, but we could add a metric that is directly related to the culture of the office, how we do our work, and the focus on equity. And I know that our director of operations would welcome that. I certainly would welcome that. And so we could think about, I'm drafting this on the spot, but having something that focuses on building the staff team and strengthening it with a focus on our equity objectives, our plans in that front, and kind of a healthy work culture focused on the staff values that we've collaboratively developed, and our strengths-based approach to interacting with each other. We could combine that all into an objective. And one way that we could measure that is to do an annual staff survey, do an annual engagement survey of the staff. I know I'm familiar with the annual survey that's done at the federal level of federal employees. We could think about modeling something smaller off of those kinds of best practices and do an annual employee engagement survey. That could be one metric to address kind of our success in building an office culture. That's not just about, we filled all 26 positions, but we filled them in such a way and are doing our work that really ensures that we're focusing on supporting our employees and having a strong culture.
See a thumbs up from Gavin, some heads nodding yes, a thumbs up from Javier, Amy. All right, there we go. Thank you. Any additions or yeah, Gavin?
So you sort of teased something, and I wanted to see if that we can capture it in some manner, right? So much of what our success is going to be is dependent upon the activities from others, right? So we can't capture and hold them accountable in this, but we should hold ourselves accountable to managing those processes and those relationships in a way that both minimizes recalcitrance or sort of recalcitrances. I'm making some assumptions that I should not make, so I apologize. I withdraw that word. But the sort of managing both the set of expectations and managing the process of getting people to a place where everybody is fully participating in the system.
So Gavin, it's kind of like, what's C2C's part as they move forward,
that's right.
Right? And how do we hold ourselves?
We don't have control over everything, obviously, but we do have control over both the getting to as much of everything as we can and managing internal and external interactions and engagement to make sure that what we're doing is as much as can be possibly done next, that sort of thing.
Thank you. And I appreciate the comments about wordsmithing on the fly. So we do have some ways of, we don't have to finalize all of these precisely today. We've got some options for getting these done. So if everybody's generally feeling good about these, this is the direction we can go.
I'm curious. I really appreciate Marianne, your comments and the thoughtfulness about the measurement instruments. I'm curious, Gavin, do you have any thoughts around how we would be managed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I'm suggesting it, I'm giving, I'm not finding an easy answer to that question. So it may be something that we can't figure out how to measure.
Is it perhaps another survey?
No, because it's mostly sort of an internal. Right, so it's mostly sort of an operations activity. That's a little bit about sort of managing relationships, seeing around corners, and that sort of thing. And that's why I'm struggling trying to figure out how to measure it.
It's a little bit like, how can we be easy to work with? Right? How are our processes? Right.
I wonder if one way, it's still close to the bone right now, but it's like the time frames in which are set and which transactions or things occur. If they're met and they're timely, it's a good indication that relationships are good, people are flowing. If it's like a struggle, then it becomes like time frames are slipping and so on, and that's an indicator.
Yeah, I appreciate that measure. And it gets a little tricky. It goes back to, well, why is the time frame slipping, right? Was that on us? Or are we waiting on somebody else?
Yeah. And I
Exactly.
think it invites the introspection and assessment wherever it may fall.
Does that get at this fully functioning state entity? Is that part of what we're assuming in the fully functioning? Is this experience that our partners have?
By partners, do we mean those on the governing board and the partner entities that are providing information?
Sorry, that was my word. That might not be the appropriate word there.
I think
I guess I'm just wondering who this managed expectations, whose expectations, and who would be placing those on. So I don't know if Gavin, you want to expand a little bit.
So yeah, I mean, I'm actually thinking much broader than sort of governing board and sort of contributing or future contributing partners to a larger venue, most particularly a future governor's office and a future legislature, and sort of making sure that everything's transparent in those relationships as well, and they know what we're doing at any one time. And by extension, the public, right?
To what extent would this be covered under engagement rather than operations?
Yeah. True.
Question.
Because engagement, it would be internal and external.
So here, as we think about operations, maybe we're just really focused internally on how we're working together, getting things done, getting our house in order, and that we can capture some of the experience others have around engagement. Is that the idea, Jessica? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Marianne, you look like you're thinking on that.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so hearing all of this, I'm hearing three sets of entities, right? So one would be our data partners who provide data to us. The other would be other state entities we're working with, right? So everything from Department of Finance to CDT to others that we need to work with just to get the work done. And then the third group is what Gavin just mentioned, right? Future governor's office, future legislature, the public. Some of that last group would definitely be captured under engagement and some of the metrics we may have for that. I wonder if maybe part of what we could make explicit here as an objective is what we're already doing, which is being very transparent about our process, our timelines, including when they shift, and doing our best to communicate clearly and set clear expectations of what we need from different entities in order to be able to deliver on all of the areas of work. So essentially, this would be an objective that would capture what we already have in our governance manual of having an annual work plan that gets updated, of having this strategic planning process that creates clear goals and objectives. So the concise way to put that would be an annually updated, transparent plan that clarifies timelines and expectations for collaborating organizations or something like that. I think that gets at maybe the first two sets that we talked about. It doesn't address Gavin's last point on kind of the more public facing engagement work, which we can capture when we get to engagement in the next meeting.
Yeah.
Does this address what you were hoping to raise initially on this point, Gavin?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to keep the language in there for the yellow one, but note that that will, in concept, move to engagement, and that we can kind of refine this last one. So we've added 2 to our original 6, I believe.
Yeah, and the way I'm looking at it, again, for the ad hoc committee's consideration is those first couple of bullet points really get at staffing, and putting the team in place. The subsequent ones talk about establishing the office overall. And then toward the end, we're getting to the way that we're operating, right? That we're operating within our core values. We're operating in a way that meets expectations. Like it starts to get at the hallmarks of performance and the way that we want to conduct business. Does that seem to make sense? When we start to thread together these pieces, when we look at the totality of this operations domain, does it seem to capture what we're looking for out of this part of the plan? And then also, does it address the problem statement that we had set forward?
So I've got the problem statement up right now, just to revisit, but let me move to that goal. If this is what you're setting out to do, are those the objectives that need to happen first, and in that order?
I really appreciate Robert's framing of the objectives, and I do believe that they hit those really important concepts that we want to have in our objectives towards meeting this goal.
Excellent.
In terms of figuring out the timing of everything, should we add dates to the 2 bullet points that we added to see where they fit in?
So let's see. I'm going to look at this bottom one first. Does the annually satisfy that for the 6th? And I see a thumbs up. Jessica?
I guess I'm thinking about like when would the first one be? Like beginning such and such. Like, so is that something that we would be wanting to like do we consider that we already have like a transparent plan through the documentation that's currently on the website?
We
Second,
currently have a 5-year work plan that's been adopted, approved by the governing board.
okay.
I believe the governance manual has the board revisiting that annually at the August meeting. So if you wanted to, you define that, you could say, you know, annually in is August late summer, early fall. The first meeting after the start of the fiscal year, if you wanted to make it that specific, or we could keep it annually. In terms of the annual employee engagement survey, I would recommend that we run the first one, say maybe at the beginning of each calendar year. That would give us time to fully staff our first, you know, the currently established positions, and hopefully the 10 additional ones as well. So it's say, you know, in early 2024, if you want to have a start date for that.
Okay.
One other tiny edit, if we want to wordsmith, is for the last bullet point, I would recommend saying clarifies timelines and expectations for C2C and collaborating organizations, so that it's clear it's both about our work and the dependencies from others.
Wonderful, thank you. So keeping in mind that we have one more focus area for today, do you think with what we've captured the intent and essence of what this group is after, so that we can maybe finalize some edits and recommend these to your governing board in August for adoption? Seeing some nods. Great. If so, I think our next step might be, Robert, I could hand it over to you for a motion on what we have, but we might revise that motion to make sure that it captures our ability just to refine these and make sure we get them right. So let me see.
That's right. So to to make this thing operational, to operationalize this for us as an ad hoc committee, what we'd want is with these appropriate edits to then make a motion to recommend to the governing board the approval of this operations goal and the objectives, and then to delegate the committee chair, which is me, and the governing board chair, which is Amy, to verify staff's incorporation of these amendments as they are presented to the governing board. So would anyone like to make this motion?
Thomas, you raising your hand, or is that your?
I shall make the motion if that's all right with folks, since no one seems to be volunteering. Do you need me to read this, or just me saying I make the motion? Okay.
Make the motion's fine. We acknowledge that you've made the motion. Anyone would like to second the motion?
I'll second the motion.
So we've got Javier second. Great. Wonderful. At this point, we can move to public comment.
I don't see any public comments thus far, although there was a question from Noah. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Noevayar Lee. Pardon my lack of knowledge. When you mention the staff survey, can you give more context of who this could be? Are they CDE, a separate C2C entity? My presumption is that's a reference to the C2C entity. Is that correct, Marianne?
That's correct. And just for clarity for the public, The Office of Cradle-to-Career Data is housed within the Government Operations Agency. And so this would be referring to the staff of Cradle-to-Career specifically. We're not housed within one of our data partners as an entity. We're housed within the Government Operations Agency.
Good. Any public comments?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, so seeing none, there will be other opportunities for public comment after the next discussion, as well as at the very end for general public comments related to the work of this ad hoc committee. So let's now do a roll call vote. Catalina Cifuentes,
Yes.
Gavin Payne,
Yes.
Amy Fong.
Yes.
I believe that captures everyone in the committee, having recognized Tom and then Javier as seconding the motion. And then I also vote yes. Julia, did we capture everyone?
Did we miss Jessica?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Jessica.
Yes, I vote yes.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Okay, let's, the motion is approved. Let's move to our next item.
All right, great progress. Thank you all. We are on a roll. So let's continue that now with our next area, analytical data. So Marianne, again, will you walk us through the problem, goal, and draft objectives?
Sure. So remembering, taking a step back on the substance of our work, we have it divided. Some of the work of connecting data is divided into two different areas. One is the analytical data. That's what we're talking about today. The other is the practical tools for students and families, like californiacolleges.edu and eTranscript. We're not talking about that second one today. So this is just about the analytical data. And the problem that this area of our work is intended to solve, we discussed last time, data is siloed in different state level entities, making it harder for decision makers to answer important questions. And then if we can go to the next, for the goal, this has been edited slightly based on your feedback in the last meeting. So the goal, as we've currently drafted it, is to build a linked analytical data set that connects existing state level data on education and job outcomes, and that will be actionable and empower decision-making on important questions. So we've highlighted the two areas where we made some small wordsmithing edits. One was to include the word actionable. So that's a nod towards ensuring that we're building something that's actually useful and actually used. And the edit to move from, I think we had decision makers, and there was a lot of question around who are decision makers. Does that mean elected officials? Does that mean a parent? And so we've edited that to say, be about decision making. So the focus is on the information being actionable and useful, as opposed to who is making the decision, so that this can be inclusive of the many different use cases. So maybe before we go to the objectives, should we just pause for a moment on whether those edits capture your comments from last time?
I see a thumbs up. Another thumbs up, a third. All right, I've got Amy, Robert, Javier. Thank you. Perfect. All right, let's move to objectives. And Marianne, I think, again, it makes sense if you just want to read through all of them first, and then we'll pause for discussion. And on this one, we only have one slide. So this is all of the objectives.
Okay, thank you. So I'll read through the objectives and then we can provide a bit of context. So on the analytical data, possible objectives, data providers submit reliable and timely data annually that C2C links and keeps secure. So that would be an annual objective. And we've paired this with a goal of having a first submission in fall of 2023. And then the next objective is to release a first dashboard on a priority topic by spring 2024. Develop a data request process for the secure data enclave for researchers to conduct studies by winter 2024. A query builder that enables disaggregation by spring of 2025. And then the last bullet point is kind of the summary one. By summer 2026, the linked analytical data set contains multiple domains: education, workforce, health, and human services. And that's a nod to the phased in approach that was mapped out during the planning process. So just big picture, think of this as the first bullet point is the foundation. Those are the annual submissions of data to us and our responsibility of keeping those data secure. The next three are the public facing ways that those data can then be useful. So dashboards, query builders, and a data request process and secure data enclave for researchers. And then the last bullet point is about kind of the reach and extent of the analytical data set. Just a few things to note before we start our discussion. So again, our main target is linking analytical data across education, workforce, health, and human services. And also just want to highlight that these are stretch objectives. Last August, we put together a 5-year timeline that updated the timeline from the planning process and a 12-month work plan. And some of the targets from that 12-month work plan were both very ambitious and helped us move quickly, but we've had to adjust. So for example, that 12-month work plan and the targets we put in it helped us move through the procurement process, the project approval lifecycle or PAL process, much more quickly than is typical. So I'm glad that we did have those ambitious timelines. And also we've needed to push back some of the things in that timeline, specifically around when we'll be ready to accept data from our partners. So just wanted to share that big picture first. So back over to Jane.
Thank you. So again, as we start to discuss these, we'll want to consider what are we required to do? What's the logical order? What has to be in place before the other things can happen? And just the complexity around this work, right? And I appreciate, Marianne, the context around the stretch goals. So as we look at that, let's consider what's doable here.
I'd like to, first of all, thank the both of you for putting this together and appreciate that. Certainly that first goal of just linking and submitting the data. This is like one of our core competencies and has to be called out, because without that, we don't have any work, right? And so it is absolutely crucial. The other thing I want to accentuate, in part because of what Marianne mentioned, the number of data providers on whom we are dependent as an entity is immense. And I think it's worth appreciating that, because in an effort to be inclusive and to try to ensure that we can answer all of these different questions around education, workforce, health, and human services issues, we have to incorporate and bring together so many different data providers. And as a consequence, it might seem understated when we talk about data providers submitting reliable and timely data, but that is a hard task for this office. And to make, perhaps in other settings, it wouldn't be such a significant objective to say that we're going to submit these things in a reliable and timely fashion every year. But for this new entity, I think it is, and I think it is worth highlighting and spotlighting that within this ad hoc committee. So, thanks to Jane and Marianne for helping to set that context for us, because I do think that is something that we have to help contextualize here in some way, shape, or form.
I feel like I should increase the font size on that one, maybe. That's a big one. Amy?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, Rara is absolutely right. We absolutely need to have that as the foundation for the entire data system, and in order for it to be realized, right? I mean, we sort of have to remember at the end of the day, we're all in this to make sure that we are actually building a data system and that it is serving the needs of the constituents here in California. I'm curious, Marianne, because, while these objectives that are proposed are seem to follow our 5-year work plan. Can you give us some additional context, maybe some, some ways we think that these are still achievable?
Sure. So I think the way I would describe these timelines is that they are still quite ambitious. They are achievable if all of the dependencies come together at the right time. So what do I mean by that? As some examples over this past year, we did have a number of delays due to procurements taking longer than expected, bringing contractors on board taking longer than expected. So I would say that these timelines are achievable, but that there are multiple dependencies across the review that our security task force needs to complete. That's the task force with all of our different data providers, needing to review what our contractors are continuing to refine and finalize around our security protocols, various ongoing questions around legal questions or other things that will come up over time. And then just the contingencies of having so many providers. I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind. Robert highlighted this. Most other states in building these kinds of systems have added data partners one at a time, gradually over time. So it's both that we have more partners and also that the nature of how California's systems are set up is more complex. So many states, for example, have one higher education entity. California has 3 just amongst the public, not to mention AICCU and those outside the public higher education system. So the structure of California itself makes this work more complicated too. So, a key for all of this is that the overarching data sharing agreements that were signed last summer can facilitate this work across many entities and have enough flexibility built in that this work can continue to evolve over time. So, I think the main question for you as a governing board to think about is that, a risk-averse approach would be to erase the first 4 bullet points and just say, we'll build this data system by summer 2026. Having these specific ambitious interim timelines for the specific pieces we want to release at different times, I think will be helpful for moving our shared work because we have so many partners together. But we need to have a comfort level knowing that we're talking about these publicly and transparently. 2 things are true. These are ambitious timelines that are necessary to get the work done. And it's possible because of the complexity that some of these dates will need to be adjusted. So what's our comfort level with that? How does that sit with you as a governing board? And we can discuss more about the trade-offs of that. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, given the work that our data partners have done over the last months, it's been very positive in terms of the file specifications and other work across our technical teams, making tremendous progress. And the contractors we're working with are also making progress. These are achievable, but there are multiple contingencies that all need to align.
Thanks, Marianne. Thoughts on that?
I'm quite comfortable with that approach, Marianne. In fact, I would encourage it. Just to ensure that it gets done. And yes, it's uncomfortable because there's many factors that come into play. And yes, you then have to stand before somebody and say, we're moving that line 2 more months. But nevertheless, it's putting pressure on everyone, which is a good thing to move the items. I wholeheartedly encourage you to maintain that approach.
I agree. Sometimes it's very motivating to have those milestones, right? So that we can all stand around, make sure we're clear-sighted, clear-hearted about what we need to accomplish.
I like the fact that there's some public facing ones in there as well as internal. So for example, the first dashboard on a priority topic by spring 2020 for calling that out, because I do believe that we also have to, that's yet another layer, right? It's one thing to get the systems talking and to get the data and to secure it. it's quite another to actually have a deliverable that the public can use. And I think that that is also important to build in there alongside all of our other more internal and operational objectives within the analytical domain.
Thank you, Robert. Others?
I think part of it is, I agree generally, that, we should have these general dates and timeframes just to hold ourselves accountable. I think, but, by extension, as Marianne noted, what California is trying to do with our own data system is very ambitious, especially compared to what other states have done before, especially, the early ones, right, that started up in like 2008, 2009, 2010, whatever. And the size and scope of what we're trying to achieve here is very ambitious. And I think, being transparent, about, these timeframes, but also the possibility that, because of what we're trying to achieve, it's some things may be delayed by a little bit, but the more that we can stress that, especially with policymakers, the more clear and transparent we are with our timeframes and what we want to achieve, but also being realistic as well.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I've heard putting pressure on and motivating. So we'll use them both.
I hope not to pile on. I'm not sure if this is scope creep, but I see, so there's the first dashboard, but I'm wondering about subsequent dashboards. Like, is the implication that we will, like, once we accomplish the first dashboard, then we talk about the next one, or are we trying to get all these other pieces done before we talk about a second dashboard?
Our ideal would be to do both.
Mhm.
I expect that there will be a tremendous demand for the query builder and the data request process.
Mhm.
And so I would not want the build of additional dashboards to displace that. So
Sure.
in a perfect world, where everything's going swimmingly and all contractors are marching in the same direction, we're fully staffed, everything's working well, we should be able to do both.
Okay.
And the implications certainly, I mean, we have a public page on our website that outlines the half dozen or so dashboards that were outlined during the planning process as being the ones that are intended to be made. So I think those are there. I think we have too little information right now, given the stage that we're at, to try to have specific dates for specific numbers of additional dashboards at this stage.
Sure. Would it be enough to even say when we want to create a priority of those dashboards, or is that something that is also kind of too soon to tell for prioritizing the subsequent ones?
I would recommend that we tackle prioritization after we've received data from our partners.
Okay, sounds good.
Catalina, you had your hand up, but yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. And I have a little bit to go off of Jessica's question from mine. And I'm assuming the answer is going to be, hopefully it's going to be yes, but I think sometimes we work on something to get to this final product, like a dashboard, and it's public and there's pieces, but in the first drop of the data, you can see that there's a possibility, there's a connection, there's a gap, there's something we can do now. As it's kind of, Mary, do you see like we're going to be spinning two plates, right? Like sometimes we don't need to make it public and do all to know that we have a problem that we could probably solve if we just did this, this, and this. Does that make sense within these 4 agencies, let's say? So it's almost like or is everything, it's like, let's wait till it's a public dashboard. It has the process of being able to do something with this data live now must go through that public type of process first. Does that make sense?
Just to make sure I'm understanding your question, are you asking about like a beta launch of something, or kind of internally looking at information before it's public?
Kind of both. So like an example, if you're getting information from data providers from, let's say it's, I'm trying to think of, let's say it's a CSAC and it's the housing group, or it's, social services, and there's something there within the data of a gap of information that we can do for students or for provider, do we have to wait until this is the public dashboard? Does that make sense? Like, what would that process look like to do things?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of processes that are already ongoing that can help address that. What I think I'm hearing you say is we should have an iterative approach to these dashboards and not drop something once and not touch it again. So one is that we're doing user-centered design from the start to try to ensure we have input on what people want. The second is I think our advisory boards will play a really important role in, part of the objective, especially of the Data and Tools Advisory Board, is to ensure that we're producing dashboards that are useful. And if they identify significant gaps, there's now a formal process that they can use to make recommendations for how a dashboard could be improved if there's a gap that they see in it, for instance. So those mechanisms are already there. And we can think about that. I think, again, to Jessica's point, there will be some trade-offs that we'll need to consider in terms of continuing to iterate and refine one dashboard versus releasing new and additional ones. But our expectation is not that we would release a dashboard and then have an automated data update process for years to come, and we don't revisit the content of it and what's feeding into it. So I think the short answer is yes, and I think our focus on user-centered design and the advisory board roles provide some formal mechanisms to do that. I think the other piece is that the pairing the dashboards with a query builder also enables the information that flows into the dashboard to be more broken apart, disaggregated, used by different people for different purposes, which might address some of that too. If there's a gap where it's like, oh, wouldn't it be great if the following question could be answered? We don't have the information for that. Then we have the mechanisms in place where that can be elevated and considered.
Thank you.
Mariana, I imagine that when we talk about engagement in that domain, we'll talk about the advisory boards, the roles that they play. So maybe there's a little bit of that we could tease out there to Catalina's point around how to ensure that they're engaged in the process. And of course, the user-centered design mechanism that has been made a priority by the office. Anything else for our analytical data pieces? There's been some conversation around the dependencies. There's been some conversation around like the order of it and whether it makes sense. How are we feeling about, in light of the discussion right here with the ad hoc committee, how are we feeling about this set of objectives?
I just wanted to add a comment because I think that the points that Jessica and Catalina brought up are important ones. And I would love it if we could lean back on our annual work plan process to revisit some of these questions so that we're timely in providing, these analytical tools or what have you, to our constituents out there. But overall, I believe these are good objectives. I like the specificity around the timeframes. Again, as a motivating factor, which some of the other members have already addressed.
Others? All right. Hearing no additional comments. No wordsmithing? Sorry, I'm not trying to encourage it. You're doing it. Robert, what do you think?
We can certainly go for a motion similar to what we did with the previous one, if the group is prepared for it. I think one of the, this is more of just an observation. I think the specificity of it and the fact that it's, it's concise, right? These are some concise objectives that really cut to the core of what we're trying to do with the analytical part of our plan. Kind of helps this one move forward a little bit more. And it's much clearer, right, in terms of deliverables about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So having said that, are we ready for a motion from the group? Anyone would like to make a motion to move to recommend to the governing board to approve the analytical data goals and objectives?
I move to approve.
I'll second.
Javier moves to approve. Gavin seconds. Let's go to a public comment first. Any members of the public would like to comment on the analytical data goals and objectives? Seeing none in the chat and seeing no other comments, let's move to a roll call vote. Catalina Cifuentes,
Yes.
Jessica Moldoff,
Yes.
Amy Fong,
Yes.
Tom Vu,
Yes.
and I also move to pass. So yes. So the motion is approved. And now we get to the next part of the agenda, which includes our next step. So let me turn it over back to Jane.
All right, wonderful progress. So we will move on. We just are nearing the end of meeting number 2, and we are ready to go for meeting number 3. It's in just about a month that we'll come back together and have a similar conversation, but this time on practical tools and also engagement. And we'll make sure that we've captured some of those conversations today that we can address once we get to engagement. So updating those materials. We will then be ready to take both the recommendations from today and the recommendations at meeting number 3 to your governing board in August. At this point, I believe we go back to general public comment.
Yes, so invite again members of the public who have any general comments about the work of the Strategic Planning Ad Hoc Committee. I don't see any at the moment, but I'll pause just for a few more seconds to see if there are any members of the public who would like to provide their questions and or their ideas. So seeing none, let's move to the next part of the agenda. Future agenda items. Are there any future agenda items for us here, Jane, Marianne?
So we've outlined what will be generally on the agenda for the 3rd meeting. That agenda is not released yet, but that will be practical tools and engagement.
Okay.
This would just be an opportunity if there's anything else that folks think they'd like to propose for a future agenda, being that meeting or another. I'm not seeing any or hearing any there. Again, public weigh in on any future agenda items. Not seeing any hands. Hearing any voices. Robert, back
So
to
we've
you.
reached, yes, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our scheduled agenda items. I want to thank all of you for your participation, your engagement, your work on the 2 domains we discussed today, operations and analytical data. Looking forward to our next discussion. With that, it is 2:10 p.m. And if there are no objections, seeing none, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.